Hello and welcome to the podcast, Jamie Johnson. Today we're going to be talking about pain science. So Jamie, if we were in a clinic with you for 60 seconds and you were with our listeners, tell us who you are and what you do.
I'm a registered massage therapist in Victoria, British Columbia. Before I was a massage therapist, I was an industrial first aid attendant in a sawmill, and I've been a firefighter for the last 18 years. So now I got a career firefighter job, so I do that 2 days a week, and I work in the clinic 2 days a week. And ever since I started as a therapist back in 2011, I've been pretty heavily involved in sport. So I worked with our local hockey team for 7 years. Then I was with our national men's rugby sevens team for a year. And I've been with Hockey Canada in the women's development program for the last 5 years. So that's all in addition to my practice, and then run a blog called the Massage Therapist Development Center.
Cool. And obviously you're really busy with the ice hockey and all that going on. So how
Yeah.
do you fit that kind of thing into your day?
Well, I'm fortunate with hockey, like working with Hockey Canada, because it's just a couple times a year. So we usually have a camp in August in Calgary. So we'll go out there for 2 to 3 weeks and just do the camp. And then depending on which team I end up with, then usually in January or like end of December, beginning of January, usually going for world championships or something like that if I'm with the under 18s. So I was in Slovakia this last year doing that. So it's just a couple times a year to go with them.
Great stuff. So as sports therapists or therapists, we obviously need to know about pain science. So can you just expand on that and what you sort of understand by pain science?
Well, it's kind of funny because a lot of people think that it's a new technique or something like that, which it isn't. It's more um, understanding how pain works in the body, but also understanding that there's things other than just tissue damage that influence a person's pain. So I think a really good example is you take we look at the biopsychosocial aspects of pain. So if we were to look, and just because my experience is in hockey, if we were to look at a player who maybe is out with a concussion, in the old days, it was always that you put them in a dark room and you keep them away from everything. Whereas now we've started to understand that that's not really beneficial for somebody with a concussion. So we look at things like, the psychosocial aspects of it are they still doing things with the team? Do they still have that social surrounding and the support of their team while they're dealing with an injury like a concussion? Are there psychological factors that are influencing the level of pain that person is experiencing or that athlete is experiencing? And quite often it can be that you look at like an old injury that they used to have, and then they get injured again and they automatically think that it's the same as that old injury that they've rehabbed and got back. So there's a whole bunch of things kind of around it that when it comes to pain science that we look at, that it's not just tissue damage that's causing a person's pain. There can be several other things that influence the level of pain or the duration of pain that they're going to experience.
I suppose that becomes more complex when we're talking about long-term injuries, which are meaning that a player is going to be out for a prolonged period of time.
Yeah, especially when we start to look at things that are maybe chronic pain. And I think like a good example is, remember dealing with an athlete once uh, who had a torn ACL and then didn't opt for surgery and rehabbed it, and took like a year to rehab it, and then got back to playing again, and then took a big check on the ice and instantly felt pain in their knee, that they hurt their knee and was coming off the ice, and the player was going, "Oh God, not again," thinking that automatically that it had to be an ACL injury, which in this case it wasn't. So they were back playing again within 2 games because they had done the appropriate rehab, and it wasn't enough of an injury to the ACL or anything like that. But the player automatically associated that knee pain with, "Oh God, I'm going to go through this again," when that wasn't the case.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we do have players who have gone through that sort of traumatic injury, and then
Mhm.
when they are returning, obviously every little thing they're almost analysing, and they're taking that forward based upon previous experience. So we obviously need to take that into consideration as therapists too.
Totally, and I think, like, one of the things that when I teach courses and things like that I always talk about is, like, look at the other things that might be influencing what's going on with this person. So if we look at an 18-year-old kid, and like I say, for me, it's always been in hockey, but it'd be the same in any other sport, I'm sure, that, you know, you look at things that could influence them while they're out injured. They might be looking and going, oh, this is going to screw up the scholarship I was trying to get. This is going to screw up me being drafted. This is going to, you know, this is going to hurt my career down the road. And those are all sort of the psychological things that we need to take into account that somebody might be dealing with when they're going through and dealing with an injury or rehabbing an injury. So those are definitely things that we need to, you know, chat with them about, and maybe they need some help on the psychological side of that as well.
So obviously you spoke about some chronic pain type patients. So have you come across many of those patients within clinical practice? And if so, what seems to be the major issues associated with that?
Yeah, I have treated a lot of people with chronic pain over the years, and I think one of the things that happens is perhaps they were in a car accident or they had an injury that was maybe 2 years ago, and yet they're still experiencing pain. We know if we look at the healing timelines and things like that, that if there was tissue damage, that by that point the tissue healed. So there should be no reason for the person to have pain from a tissue damage standpoint. But for whatever reason, something happens that makes the brain keep sending out a pain signal, and they're still experiencing pain a couple of years later. So one of the things that I find that happens is, you know, they come in, and let's just say that 2 years ago they were having pain in the middle of their back, and they went to a practitioner who maybe said something to them like, oh, your rib is out, so that's why you're experiencing pain. And then every time they feel pain in that area, they automatically correlate it to being, oh, it's because my rib is out. So I've had lots of chronic pain patients over the years that have come in, and, you know, right away they're like, oh, I know my rib must be out again because I'm having pain in that area. Whereas we know that a rib doesn't actually go out. So quite often it can be because of a narrative or a story that they've been told that sort of keeps that pain cycle going. But for whatever reason, these poor people are dealing with pain when they shouldn't be anymore. But quite often that narrative, I think, is one of the things that perpetuates them still experiencing pain.
I think there have been some research articles around spinal pain, haven't there, where actually nerves can become more sensitized, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there's still pain there, but
Yeah.
it does manifest itself almost in the patient experiencing pain because of increased sensitivity around a radicular nerve, for example.
Yeah. When people are experiencing centralization for whatever reason, and we don't always know the reason, but they go on and experience this pain, and quite often it's going to be our job to educate them as to maybe why they're still experiencing some pain, and then what they can do to help that. Um, the central sensitization or whatever things that they have going on. And I know, like, talking to some people that are way smarter than I am, that I've learned from, they said that quite often people who deal with chronic pain will have moments throughout the day where they're not experiencing pain. And if we can kind of shift their attention to those moments and start to focus on that, then we've got a better chance of being able to help them when they're dealing with pain throughout other parts of the day.
Yeah, fantastic. And that almost brings me on to the next question, really, which is there anyone that you can point us in the direction of that we should really be looking at and sort of identifying with in terms of the leaders in pain science at this moment in time? Or are there any articles that which you've maybe come up with which we could have a look at?
Yeah, the Noi group out of Australia are really leaders in the whole pain science realm. So looking at guys like David Butler and Lorimer Moseley, they're those are both guys that I've learned a lot from by reading their stuff. And they've got a book called Explain Pain Supercharged, which is intended for practitioners to understand pain better and to be able to communicate with patients better about pain. And they do a ton of great work in Australia. And I've talked with Lorimer before, and they do a thing every year where they get on their bikes and they go to, he goes, what they call the bush in Australia. But basically what they're doing is they're going to rural communities within Australia, and they've identified a lot of those communities as ones that have a disproportionately high amount of opioid usage. And so what they do is they pick these rural communities, and they do a big bike ride there to raise money for it. And they go and they'll just educate people about pain for the weekend. And they don't necessarily go in and do any hands-on manual therapy with them. They just go in and educate pain. And I believe the last numbers I saw is they've reduced opioid usage in those communities by something like 80% just by educating the general population about pain and how they can manage pain and why pain isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's, it's an important part of our life. So those are some really great guys to follow. So they've got an organization called the NOI Group, which is NOI. So if you can follow their stuff, they're right up on the pain science research.
Yeah, great. And I think you've hit a key topic at the moment: education of patients. Obviously, having to communicate more with patients at this moment in time, and
Mm-hmm.
education is a major part of that. So, is it all really about education and listening to the patient in terms of understanding what they're going through in terms of pain science?
Yeah, yeah. When we look at the research papers on, for instance, the clinical guidelines of low back pain and how we treat it, the steps that are laid out are to reassure the patient, educate them, and get them moving is massive. Because you've got somebody who comes in and experiencing pain, and they have a belief that they're broken for whatever reason. Reassuring them that they're going to be okay, and reassuring them that they're whatever pain it is they're dealing with isn't necessarily some huge catastrophic injury. Maybe it's just something simpler, and we can use strategies and then educate them on things that they can do to get out of pain and get them moving again, and why movement is important. So I think if we looked at any musculoskeletal injury, if we took the same approach and just reassured the patient, educated them, and got them moving, we'd probably have a lot greater success as therapists.
Excellent. So, obviously, you sit within the sports therapy community, but you also host your own community as well. So, do you want to just tell us a little bit more about what your community involves?
Sure, it's based around pain science and therapeutic exercise, and one of the reasons is because I teach a live course with a buddy of mine, and one of the reasons that we put it together is to give massage therapists more confidence when it comes to doing therapeutic exercise and rehab with patients, because I know in some areas exercise isn't necessarily in the scope of practice for some massage therapists, but for where we are in Canada and British Columbia, it's well within our scope. But we found, and I found a lot with talking to other massage therapists, that they would quite often refer out to a physiotherapist or an athletic therapist or something like that to do the exercise end of things. Whereas most of it we can just do right in our clinic room, and it doesn't mean that you have to have a barbell and a squat rack and all these other things in order to help rehab what is fairly simple injuries. So that's a lot of what my community is about, is just helping other therapists understand pain better, and then how to build a rehab program with a patient, and the stages of healing, and then how to go through an isometric, concentric, eccentric load exercise with patients when they're on your table. So that's a lot of what we focus on in the membership. And then lately we've been doing lots of interviews with different people for the members, so that they can understand different aspects. For instance, we had Bronnie Thompson a week or two ago talking about motivational interviewing, and then had my friend Keith Meldrum come on to talk to us about the patient experience, and what it's like for a chronic pain patient, and what they go through, and how, if we can understand what they're going through better, we'll be able to provide better care for those chronic pain patients and people who are dealing with that.
Fantastic. So you've given us lots of information there, Jamie, lots of really high quality information regarding pain. So if any of our listeners want to find out more about you, where could they go?
My website's a good one. So it's themtdc.com. So THEMTDC.com. And then by all means on Facebook. My personal page is just Jamie M. Johnston. And then I'm on Instagram and Twitter and those things as well. Got two Instagram accounts. One's for the blog and one's my personal one. So either one. And then just, coming out to courses and things like that. If you're
Fantastic. So
around where I live.
we'll put links to those all within the show notes,
Awesome.
so that then everyone in the community can access those and be able to go through to your website and have a look at the great things that you're doing. So
Great,
just
thanks,
to finish off on, can you just tell us like 3 takeaway messages for sports therapists moving forward in their clinical practice?
Well, sure. And I think one of the big things is, as sport therapists, quite often it's not necessarily clinical practice that we're working at. We're working sidelines at sporting events and things like that. So in my opinion, and from my experience as a first responder, I think that's actually the number one thing that we need to be really good at is being a first responder, recognizing, mechanism of injury and things like that, being able to help people, whether they're on the field or on the ice, whatever your chosen sport is that you work in. But because I think that's one thing that sets the sports therapist apart from your other average therapist, is because we got to be able to deal with like maybe a severe traumatic injury that could happen to an athlete. So I think the number one thing that we need to focus on is not necessarily a new technique, but being really good first responders, to be able to help those people out when they get hurt. And I think the second thing is just to not be a jerk. There's been so many times over the years when I've worked in sport that I watched people come in and they've got a job title and they think that they're better than you at whatever they're doing, and you're there as a team, just like the athletes are. You're there to work as a team together. So just treating every therapist with respect, and realizing that we all come in with different skill sets and different abilities, and you might be better than me at one thing and I might be better than you at another thing, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't treat each other with respect and work together and do your best to work together. So that's kind of the long and short of it. I've just seen over the years where, I've watched one practitioner look at another practitioner and literally say, what you're doing doesn't work. Only what I do works. So you can kind of go sit over there. It's like, no. And typically those people don't end up getting invited back to work with sports teams and things like that, because they get weeded out fairly soon. So I think just going in with and having that collaborative viewpoint and being willing to work together with everybody. And I think the third one is just not letting your ego get in the way. I remember the first camp that I went and worked with Hockey Canada, we had like a conference call before we went out, and Mel Davidson, who was the general manager at the time, she said, you need to check your ego at the door. She said, you're all being invited out here because you're the best at what you do. You wouldn't get here if you didn't have an ego, but you need to check your ego at the door, because we all need to come out here and you're all going to fulfill a specific role. And she made some great points where she said, you might be the head trainer of the team you work with at home, but when you come here, we've got a specific role that we need you to fulfill, and you might not be the head trainer, but we need you to fulfill that specific role to the best of your ability. So, she was very much check your ego at the door, which I think is going to be important no matter what sport you're working in. And it kind of goes back to the point I was making before about not being a jerk. Just, checking your ego at the door and being willing to work together and fulfill the role that you've been brought in to do. Is probably, I think, is important for any sport therapist.
Excellent, Jamie. Thank you very much for coming on the show, and hopefully our listeners will go and find out some more about you over on your website and on your social media handles.
Yeah, no problem, man. I really appreciate you having me on. It's an honor. Appreciate that you'd asked me.